Let me out!
There are few games with a legacy as important to modern gaming as Quake. Redefining 3D graphics technology and multiplayer gaming alike, John Carmack and his team at id Software changed the face of PC gaming forever. To the surprise of no one, its success brought a sequel, Quake 2, and it stands as one of the first games designed with 3D acceleration in mind right from the start. As a benchmark title for the platform, Quake 2 demonstrated the potential of new 3D graphics hardware while exerting dominance over less powerful consoles. But two confident developers believed that there was a way to translate id Software's latest project onto these lesser machines. Today we're looking back at Quake 2 in all its forms, from the early days of its development and its release on the PC, to each official console version of the game. There's a lot here to explore. We even have genuine capture from real 3DFX Voodoo graphics hardware for that authentic flair. Let's get started. Flashback to 1997, Quake is the hottest PC game on the market. After making its debut in 1996, Quake gradually pushed the industry in new directions. With its rich multiplayer heritage made possible by Quake World, the original Quake went on to be played by millions and stands as one of the first truly successful internet-playable shooters. This is backed by a near constant flow of content created by other Quake players. The modding community around Quake was incredibly vibrant at the time, with top modders starting their career through work on Quake. The creators of Team Fortress, which got its start in the Quake engine, went on to work for Valve Software, while Stephen Polge, a longtime programmer for Epic Games, got his start through building the Reaper bots for Quake. But it's the eventual release of GL Quake, or V-Quake before it, which helped change the trajectory of 3D graphics on the PC platform. At a time when 3D accelerator cards were struggling to take off, the OpenGL release of Quake pushed many gamers to take the leap. Thus begins the rise of 3DFX and its Voodoo lineup. The Voodoo graphics officially launched in early 1997. In the wake of Carmack's work, 3DFX was quick to write a mini driver for Quake to enable full support for the GL version of the game on its hardware, and it was glorious. While I've come to enjoy the look of the software render in Quake over time, at release, the jump to GL Quake was revelatory. Higher resolutions, faster frame rates, filtered textures, and proper alpha blending all helped create something that looked unlike anything else at the time. Even as Quake continued to evolve, id remained busy working on its sequel, Quake 2. The id of 1997 was very different from that which created Doom and Quake, however. John Carmack relinquished his roles in other areas of development to focus entirely on technology, while others took the reins. John Romero was long gone, off working on his own game Daikatana using the original Quake engine. That's a story for another day, but Quake 2 did play a large role in the trajectory of its development. If we jump back to E3 1997, Quake 2 was on display, and it was very impressive. So impressive it was with its colored lighting and beautiful 3D accelerated visuals that it persuaded John Romero to drop the Quake engine and move over to the Quake 2 engine. That colored lighting contributed to a decision that would cost the development team a tremendous amount of time in the end. In comparison, Quake 2 itself went by relatively smoothly. Development continued, and it was more open than what you might expect today. John Carmack kept fans up to date via his lengthy plan files, often discussing improvements and changes being made to the engine during its development. Just a few months prior to its release, it made Q2 Test available for download then. This served as a pre-release demo of sorts with just a small handful of levels included. It was almost tradition at this point, with Quake 1 having also received an early demo in the form of Q-Test. The final game made a lot of changes from this early test build, including an updated skybox texture, full 3D explosions, new higher quality sound effects, and modified particles, just to name a few. The game also received plenty of press at the time. This enormous tome of a magazine with a huge spread on Quake 2 still excites today. Voodoo accelerated shots tantalized the senses, and on December 9th, 1997, Quake 2 was finally unleashed. From a gameplay perspective, Quake 2 is an interesting case. It was the most ambitious production id had undertaken thus far, but was almost entirely focused on the single-player experience. The shipping game did not include proper deathmatch maps. Those would be released in a patch at a later date. In retrospect, it's a strange choice considering its legacy, but the single-player experience was quite impressive nonetheless. Breaking away from tradition, Quake 2 made the jump to a hub-based structure. Each mission was divided up into units, which would send the player back and forth between different interconnected maps in order to open the path forward. It provided more structure than the traditional Quake and Doom design, but removed some of the variety from the experience in the process. The design of the world and its enemies were at least much more cohesive than the mishmash of science fiction and medieval characters that made up Quake. Quake 2 retained many of the staples of the genre that it had come to define, but upped the ante with some impressive models and animation work. The double-barrel shotgun remains one of the most pleasing weapons in existence. This was complemented by a powerful soundtrack primarily created by Sonic Mayhem, a sound which returned to the harder, faster tunes of Doom. Impressive as the game was at the time though, its greatest achievements stem from its technology. The Quake 2 engine represents a massive leap over the already groundbreaking Quake engine. For starters, Quake 2 transitioned away from MS-DOS entirely, instead shipping as a Windows 95 title. Quake C was no more. By dividing individual components into dynamic link libraries, the engine became more modular. Different renderers, such as OpenGL or software, could be toggled from within a single executable, and it was possible to extend this to include alternative renderers in the future. Quake 2 is one of the first big titles to ship with 3D accelerator support right out of the box. The transition from 8-bit color at a lower resolution to true color at high resolution was significant here. Features such as bilinear texture filtering were now possible, as were fast alpha blending and multi-texturing features. You could achieve a significant speed increase at higher resolutions than in software when using the same machine. Animation interpolation was also introduced here, allowing the game engine to smoothly interpolate between keyframes to produce smoother animation for enemies and weapons. All of the animation was keyframed at 10 frames per second, but this technique allows animation to play back as fast as the game can run. It was a tremendous leap over Quake 1, which appears rather jittery in comparison. This also highlights one drawback to the design. Vertices used to create models were not weighted against a skeleton, as would become the norm later on. It seems that the animators likely had to manually transform vertices while keyframing the animations. The visible warping present here is a side effect of this technique, and it would go on to plague all other games built using the Quake 2 engine. Levels were stored as BSPs, or binary space partitions once again, and the level lighting was pre-calculated using light map blocks, using a radiosity method. So as you can see here, we've disabled the textures in this scene using the console, and are looking at just the pre-calculated light maps used in this level. Dynamic lighting then was evolved to allow for full color when using the OpenGL renderer. The higher color depth also allowed designers to push the use of color in a way that was not previously possible. Both the dynamic lights and the full-colored light maps that you see here had to be resampled to grayscale when using the software renderer. These days, when you play Quake 2 though, it's likely done using a modern PC. Even systems from a decade ago far exceed the requirements of the original game, but to truly understand what it was to play Quake 2 at the time, we need to look back at the game running on hardware from that era. Thanks to FaneRip over on Twitter, I've been using footage captured from a proper PC of that era. Most of the footage was pulled from an original 3DFX Voodoo graphics card. I then ran the footage to the DF frame rate analysis tools just for fun, and the results are rather surprising. The original Voodoo clearly struggles with Quake 2 when run at 640 by 480, the highest supported resolution by the card. Interestingly, this is still faster than alternative cards at the time. And here's Quake 2 running on the same PC with the texture set to low. It does wind up running a little bit faster, but the impact on visual quality is also rather severe, so probably not a great way to play. For good measure, here's the game running on a 3DFX Voodoo Rush card as well. The original Voodoo was an add-in card which required a separate card for 2D. The Voodoo Rush, though, was the first attempt to pair the two, and it wasn't entirely successful, though in this case the Rush paired with a much faster CPU does perform at least as well. Keep in mind that shortly after the release of Quake 2, 3DFX would return with the Voodoo 2, which was much faster and could reach higher frame rates in Quake 2 with ease. Just for good measure then, here's a look at the game running on a much later Voodoo 5 5500. This is a very high-end card for its time, and one of the very last cards 3DFX would ever release. Capable of great performance and high-quality anti-aliasing, not to mention the old T-buffer, the Voodoo 5 was a very fascinating card that wasn't really successful. Still, despite the jump from Voodoo 1 to Voodoo 5, the 5500 was released just over 3 years after the original Voodoo graphics. The jump in performance and image quality made in just 3 years is truly astonishing. Ultimately though, Quake 2 on the PC is a game that would go down in the history books for many reasons. It would come to receive official multiplayer maps, modders would get to work on the game quickly, and it was supported for years to come. While Quake 3 Arena would eventually steal its thunder, Quake 2 was a very important game for id. But Quake 2 on the PC platform was not the end of its legacy. There is a long history of id Software games being ported to consoles. Wolfenstein and Doom alike received their fair share of ports, including some not so great efforts, but bringing a cutting-edge game like Quake 2 to a console seemed impossible, at least initially. Two developers were confident enough to prove this perception wrong: Hammerhead and Raster Productions. These two studios were selected to bring Quake 2 to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 respectively, and the end results are far more impressive than you might expect. The first of these two games to release was the Nintendo 64 port in early 1999. Created by Raster Productions, located in Mesquite, Texas, not too far from id Software I suppose, Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 is a very impressive conversion. Throughout its short life, Raster Productions would focus on bringing id Software games to consoles. Known as Aaron Sealer Productions initially, named after its founder, the company was renamed to Raster Productions in 1998 before completing work on Quake 2. And while Quake 2 is the first game produced by the Texas studio, they would also develop Quake 3 Arena for Dreamcast and Return to Castle Wolfenstein for the PlayStation 2. And Aaron Sealer was certainly no stranger to Quake either, having been a lead programmer for Midway's port of Quake 1 to the Nintendo 64. This connection starts to make a lot of sense once you first load up Quake 2. For one thing, it's clear from the start that this is not a port of the proper Quake 2 engine, rather an upgraded version of the technology powering Quake 64. The result is a game that looks close enough to the PC version, but features plenty of unique differences. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key changes made in Quake 2 was the addition of animation interpolation, which allows the engine to interpolate between keyframes. The N64 port of Quake 2, however, completely lacks this feature, instead exhibiting jerky animation just like the original Quake. In this game, it feels even worse really due to the exaggerated animations designed for Quake 2's weapons. Another interesting change is the return of moving skyboxes. The clouds in Quake 1 were legendary for the parallax effect and high speed, but the Nintendo 64 version introduced its own take on that effect. It looked pretty cool. And that's exactly what we see in Quake 2 here. It lends a very different feeling to the game world, but it looks pretty neat. It's impressive to see other areas in which this conversion compares favorably to the PC as well. Colored lighting is implemented in full, for instance, and the look of the game is spot on. Texture resolution had to be sacrificed, of course, but it still looks reasonably sharp for an N64 game, especially with the expansion pack installed. Speaking of which, clearly this is one of those games that supports the old expansion pack, but you might be wondering just what it does. The primary difference here lies in image quality and performance. With the pack installed, the frame rate is ever so slightly higher on average, though both operate with an unlocked frame rate that sees results jumping anywhere from 10 FPS up to 60 FPS. The other difference lies in image quality, with the game suffering from obvious dithering artifacts without the expansion pack installed, which results in a dirtier looking game overall. It doesn't make a tremendous difference necessarily, but given the choice, it definitely looks best with the expansion pack installed. It's also interesting to note that performance here really isn't that far off from what you would see on the PC at the time of Quake 2's launch. It does run at a lower resolution, being just 320 by 240, but the frame rate is comparable to that of a Voodoo-equipped PC from that era. Not to say that they are directly comparable, since this is not the actual Quake 2 engine running here. But what makes this title engaging even now lies in its content. Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 is a brand new game. While there are occasional elements from Quake 2 proper featured within, the overall design here is entirely original. Unlike the hub-based design of the PC game, Quake 2 for N64 features a selection of individual maps with progression similar to the original Quake, or even Doom really. You move from stage to stage with a map screen in between each level, and it works out just as you'd expect. This actually makes returning to the game easier than proper Quake 2, as each map is just large enough to be engaging without dragging on too long. It's very pick up and play. This is clearly not a port of Quake 2 then. It's a brand new game designed to look and play like Quake 2 instead, and it works quite well. The game also offers full support for up to 4 players in split screen mode, and believe it or not, the performance here is excellent. Compared to the likes of GoldenEye or Perfect Dark, which were definitely more popular but ran a lot slower, Quake 2 feels very nice to play. It might just be one of the very best multiplayer first-person shooters available on the N64. On top of this, the controls are fully customizable to your liking, and feel quite nice even now. It doesn't take long to become accustomed to the controls here, and it's good enough that I was able to finish the entire game, something I did not expect to do when picking it up. It really is a lot of fun. One other change with this version is the soundtrack. The heavy Sonic Mayhem soundtrack featured in the original game is absent on Nintendo 64, instead replaced by a more ambient score created by Aubrey Hodges, who also did Doom for the PlayStation, Quake 1 N64 soundtrack, and many more. It does change the feel of the game, but still manages to sound pretty good in the end. Overall then, Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 is a great addition to the Quake legacy. With its original levels, unique atmosphere, and solid visuals, it's actually still worth checking out today. But the N64 was already well suited to 3D graphics, which brings us to our second major conversion of Quake 2, the PlayStation version, created by Hammerhead Ltd. The PlayStation was not well known for shooters, and a game this ambitious just seemed beyond the capabilities of the hardware, but Hammerhead disagreed. Based in a small town in England, Hammerhead was founded by members that had previously worked for Traveller's Tales, which is now known for the LEGO games, but had previously created projects such as the technically impressive Toy Story and Sonic 3D Blast. The team initially adopted the name Tales 2 before switching its final name to Hammerhead. Hammerhead's first project was Shadow Master for the PlayStation and PC. It was a fast-paced vehicle shooter with an impressive 3D graphics engine. The frame rate was a lot smoother than many comparable games on the PlayStation, and the blasts of colored lighting tantalized the senses. Despite the vehicular nature of its gameplay, the design is similar to many classic PC first-person shooters. In a way, a game like Quake 2 was a natural fit for the studio. When undertaking this project, the tech team was confident that they could deliver something that maintains what made the game great, despite naysayers suggesting that Quake 2 was impossible on the platform. Well, to a degree it was. The Quake 2 engine itself would never have run well on the PlayStation, but Hammerhead worked with its own in-house technology to replicate the game as closely as possible. It's immediately evident that the visuals on display here stand above any other first-person shooter on the platform. A smooth, stable frame rate, richly detailed visuals with minimal affine texture warping, great animation, and a huge variety of options are all here. Not only that, the resolution is higher than a typical PlayStation game, running at 512 by 240. Unlike the N64 port, the PlayStation version of Quake 2 presents a variety of stages based on the PC game and its expansion packs. This can lead to some rather interesting moments. After completing the first area, for instance, the player quickly finds themselves in the very first area of the PC version, for instance. This should give you an idea of how it compares visually. It's a very different looking game on PlayStation, but in some ways it has an advantage over the original. The size and complexity of the PC levels, though, presented a problem, but Hammerhead came up with an effective solution designed to maintain as much of the original as possible. Essentially, every level is broken up into smaller chunks. New loading points are added between them, giving the impression of larger areas when connected together. This could have been a huge problem, of course, but each loading point is very quick, just a few seconds on real hardware. It feels more like a minor pause than a proper loading screen, and it works. The only downside to this approach lies in the handling of the soundtrack. Every time you run into a loading screen, the game stops the music and restarts with a different track than what was just playing. So while the full PC soundtrack is fully accounted for here, you never really get to hear much of each track since they constantly cut in and out. This stands as perhaps my single biggest gripe with the game. Still, while playing, it's hard not to marvel at what was achieved here. Affine texture swimming was a real problem on the platform, but Quake 2 manages to sidestep many of these problems by subdividing geometry based on proximity. It's a rather common trick on the PlayStation, really, but the density of the mesh here stands out the most. The game has a solid look to it that you just didn't see often on the platform. Texture quality is also top-notch for the platform, with much higher resolution assets than those used on Nintendo 64. And on top of that, lighting plays a significant role in the visuals here, with robust colored lighting used throughout every level. Lens flare effects were even implemented, further enhancing the look. It's a much more colorful game than Quake 2 proper, that's for sure. The skybox is interesting as well, since it's not actually a skybox. Instead, untextured polygons are built around each individual piece of the level where the sky would be showing, rather than an overarching skybox filling the level. Character and weapon models have also been remade, sporting a new look that resembles the original game while taking on a style of its own. Animation at least is certainly smoother than the N64 version. Playing through the game again, it feels like a greatest hits version of Quake 2, with the way many of its levels are designed and presented, but it all kinda works. The one real issue with it comes down to controls. It just doesn't feel quite right. You have multiple presets, sure, but none of them feel as good as you would need, and while the game does support dual analog controls, the mappings aren't great. Keep in mind that dual analog control was still very new at this time, so there wasn't really a standard template. In Quake 2 then, the default analog controls have the left stick going forward and back, while also turning left and right. In comparison, the right stick looks up and down, while strafing left and right. Aiming is overly sensitive, and taken together, the game ends up being a lot more difficult to play than it should be. Of course, this might be alleviated by the support for the PlayStation mouse. Unfortunately, I don't have one of these mice available, so I couldn't test it myself, but it sure sounds cool, especially since you can link up multiple mice for multiplayer. Speaking of which, like N64, the PlayStation version does support multiplayer, with up to 4 people. It's a rare thing for the system, but it's a really nice addition here. If you want to go for 4 people though, you're going to need a multi-tap, which again, I didn't have access to, so I couldn't test it. Ultimately, Quake 2 for PlayStation is one remarkable conversion. This is without a doubt the most technically impressive first-person shooter on the system, and aside from the touchy controls, still holds up beautifully today. But not long after Quake 2 for PlayStation launched, Sega had released the Dreamcast, and while there's no official version of Quake 2 in the system, I thought it would be fun to look at 2 of the attempts since I do love the system so much. The first one is just a homebrew port of the game using the software renderer. It's not great, but still fascinating nonetheless. It runs at a low resolution 320x240 mode and at a rather low frame rate. Presumably, without the aid of graphics acceleration, all of this is being run on the SH4 CPU. For a quick homebrew project then, it's fascinating, but don't expect it to play smoothly. At least it loads faster than another Quake 2 engine game on the system, Soldier of Fortune. The other port is more fascinating. It's Bleemcast. Yes, this was one of the first commercial emulators released, and was subject to many a lawsuit by Sony, though that's not what ultimately killed Bleem. The idea was simple: run PlayStation games on your Dreamcast at a higher resolution. Unfortunately, in the end, the full Bleemcast pack and the associated hardware, such as adapters that would let you use PlayStation controllers on the system, never released, and instead Bleem produced just 3 discs with support for 3 games. Of course, Quake 2 is running here on one of the beta versions modified to run more games. Amazingly, the results are pretty excellent. The resolution and frame rate are higher on average than we see on PlayStation, and the game plays without any major problems aside from missing sound effects and a lack of buttons. It's not the best way to play this version of the game, mind you, but it's neat to see it running so well on the Dreamcast. The higher resolution and use of texture filtering, though, do conflict somewhat with the visuals, and the limitations of the rendering are brought to light as a result. Still, as a piece of history, it's cool to see this working. Over the next few years, Quake 2 would see additional modifications and source ports, as the source code had been released in 2001. But the next official port would come as a surprise: Quake 2 for Xbox 360. I've discussed this in the past with an article published more than 2 years ago, but to reiterate, Quake 2 for Xbox 360 was included as a bonus disc with Quake 4, a launch game for the system. It was programmed by Brian Harris, who now works for Nvidia, and served as a simple project for testing the system. It's a great looking conversion that runs beautifully, but the most surprising aspect remains its rendering resolution. You see, at the launch of Xbox 360, the system was only capable of outputting at either 720p or 1080i. 1080p was uncommon at the time, and HDMI was not yet included on 360 consoles. But in testing the game on an updated 360, we were surprised to discover that Quake 2 supports full 1080p at 60 frames per second, years before 1080p was officially supported by Microsoft's console. On top of this, it features 4x MSAA and 16x anisotropic filtering. The game looks brighter and more beautiful too. Brian implemented a gamma and intensity conversion shader here to restore the look originally intended. Dynamic light maps were also increased in resolution, and geometry calling is disabled entirely due to the faster hardware. Even 4-player split screen was implemented. The point is, for a freebie included with Quake 4, this port of Quake 2 is very impressive. If not for the controls, which aren't fully tuned for a gamepad, it would be an awesome and simple way to enjoy Quake 2 anytime on a console. Maybe someday we'll see it running via backwards compatibility on Xbox One. Wishful thinking, I suppose. But that likely raises the question then of how to play Quake 2 today. Thus far, I've shown lots of footage from Yamagi Quake 2 in this episode, and it's one of my favorite source ports as it delivers a very standard Quake 2 experience with full soundtrack support and great visuals. It's fast and supports any resolution you care to throw at it. There's also a modified software renderer available which produces interesting results that look different from what you might be used to, but I tend to think that Quake 1 works better in software mode than the sequel. Then there's ports like Quake 2 XP with new assets and huge engine changes. This version updates Quake 2 with modern rendering techniques and new assets galore. This is of course the 2016 Quake Expo edition, and well, it looks pretty nifty, I think. Lots of new shaders and effects are in play with hugely advanced lighting throughout. Specular highlights and bump mapping play a huge role as well, giving extra depth to the world. It's basically Quake 2's shiny modern edition. If you're looking for a new way to play Quake 2 in 2017, this might just be the way forward. There is one other rather strange version out there though, the Zeebo version. That's right, Tectoy released a version of Quake 2 for the Zeebo, a console designed for developing markets in Brazil and Mexico. It's a 3G enabled device, and you just download the game and play. Now unfortunately I had to turn to low quality footage uploaded to a YouTube channel simply because I have no way of really obtaining a Zeebo, at least for any sort of reasonable cost, and even if I could, who's to say I could even use it? Either way, it's pretty cool that this exists, and in some ways it sort of occupies the same space as Duke Nukem 3D for Sega Genesis. However you choose to play though, Quake 2 remains an important and legendary game. From its technology, which would serve as the foundation for so many other titles, to its multiplayer community, Quake 2 has served as a foundation for so many things we love about gaming today. And you know what? There are still loads of people playing Quake 2. It's been 20 years since the game was released, and it is still as beloved as ever. That's how you know a real classic. And with that, we've reached the end of another episode. And if you couldn't guess by now, Codec Frequency 140.98 won the vote on the Metal Gear episode, hence the reason for going with Quake 2. But there's more to it than that. You see, we've just about crossed the anniversary point for DF Retro as a series. The very first episode, Quake for Sega Saturn, debuted on May 30th, 2016. So I figured why not tackle Quake 2? So I just want to say many thanks to everyone that has supported DF Retro since its inception. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, as always, be sure to let me know by liking, subscribing, and following me on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
You